so much for having me here today. I'm Allison Liuzzi. Pronouns are she, her. I used to teach undergraduate statistics right after lunch. I know what this sounds like. You're going to feed me a bunch of data right as I just had my dessert. Please stay with me. I've got some interesting stories, I promise. I told my table, it's more interesting than it sounds. So I'm going to sort of zip through some of this, and do you want me to? Yeah, you bet. Okay. First, I want to start with big picture. We all know the pandemic hit about a year and a half ago, and our economy and workforce have really struggled. So I want to give you some context before I dig into things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. Where have we been over the last year and a half? Well, let me start with where we were in the decade or two leading up to the pandemic. This shows you total jobs in Minnesota over time since 2000. And you can see we've had some dips and dives, the Great Recession there between about 2007 and 2010, where we lost net about 120,000 jobs in the state. We have more than recovered that since the Great Recession. And going into 2020, jobs were still on an upward incline, but let's zoom into 2020 and 2021. As all of you know, jobs took a really severe hit in early 2020 because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We lost about 360,000 net jobs in the span of a month, okay? So when we look at the Great Recession, net loss of about 120,000 jobs over 3 years. We look at the pandemic, 3 times the number of job losses in a month. So really severe downturn in a really short period of time. We've been sort of recovering over time in the same way that we track sort of these waves of COVID, positivity cases. We're also seeing some sort of waves of job recovery, but so far, over the last several months anyways, we've seen some steady ticks up. So we seem to be getting to a better place. That said, we're still about 70,000 jobs short of being back where we were at pre-pandemic levels. So we've got some recovery still left to do. And when we talk to small business owners, we know that they are still very much in the thick of the COVID-19 pandemic. As of the end of June or early July, when small business owners were surveyed, about a quarter of them said they're still experiencing a large negative effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on business, and only about 40% of small businesses are currently operating at normal, what they consider normal levels. So we've got work to do. You all look so sad. Okay, all right. And I mean, the good news was we were in a really good place coming into this pandemic. So Minnesota in general is home to really a strong labor force, a strong economy. We were, at least in 2019, home to one of the highest proportions of adults working in the nation, tied with North Dakota at about 80% of adults working, and then Nebraska kind of sneaks in there at third. So we came in a relatively good position, and hopefully that helps us with our recovery across the state. But since the pandemic, almost half of workers have filed some sort of unemployment insurance claim for the first time. Half of people. That's a really, really large share of our workforce that's had to file for unemployment. And we know that some populations of workers have been hit harder. So clearly, employees working in hotels and restaurants and other leisure and hospitality industries, younger workers under age 35, and workers with a high school degree or GED. These are populations that saw their unemployment levels get up into the 50s and 60%, sometimes 70%. We also know that there are large differences in unemployment insurance claims by race. So when we look at all Minnesotans, it was about half who had to file a new uninsurance claim since the start of the pandemic, but 78%, nearly 8 in 10 American Indian workers, and more than 9 in 10 Black workers. So really stark disparities when you think about 9 out of 10 Black workers in Minnesota who had to file an unemployment insurance claim since the start of the pandemic. So as we think about recovery coming out of the pandemic, as we want to see those jobs continue to increase, we also have to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion being at the center of those efforts to rebuild. We need to recruit the workforce in the same way that we see in our population, right? Stan, right? Yes. We want people in our jobs to reflect the communities that they serve. And so this has to be central to the ways we think about recovering and rebuilding. Why? Well, first of all, demographic trends all point in the direction of our populations of color growing while our white population pretty much levels off. Today there are about 1.2 million people who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or what we would call BIPOC. That's only going to continue to increase over the next several decades. And the share of our overall populations are changing as well. So going back to 1960, about 1% of all Minnesotans identified as BIPOC. We're headed towards about a quarter statewide. And then in the Twin Cities area, those percentages will be even larger. When we break this out into finer races and ethnicities, you can see relative sizes of different BIPOC communities. Our Black population is our largest of the BIPOC communities. We've seen 36% growth in our BIPOC population since 2010. This is where almost all of our population growth is coming from. Our workforce is going to look very different in 10 years, 20 years. Our emerging workforce is much more racially and ethnically diverse than our retiring baby boomers. Breaking it down even finer, these are some of Minnesota's largest cultural communities, and you can see our African American, Mexican, Native American communities. When we sort of use a finer level of disaggregation, we have very large and very diverse cultural communities in Minnesota. As I mentioned, almost all population growth is coming from our populations of color. What does that mean? Well, hopefully you all filled out your decennial census forms. We kept our 8th congressional seat in Minnesota, which is fantastic. But we also learned some things about the ways our population is changing. We saw a net gain of about 350,000 residents in Minnesota since 2010. Of that, 90% of our net gain was from BIPOC populations. So almost all of our population growth, 90% of it, is coming from growth among BIPOC populations. This says everything about what our workforce is going to look like in 10 to 20 years. Because it has a lot to do with age. About 10% of our baby boomers, those who are in like the retirement age range, identify as BIPOC. Among Gen X, kind of the lost generation in a lot of conversations, about 20% are BIPOC. And among our millennial population, who is squarely in the workforce now, so we're not even talking about the next generation, about 26% are BIPOC. So when we think about our workforce rebuilding and recovering from COVID-19 pandemic, but also looking ahead 10 to 20 years, hopefully when this pandemic has subsided, this says who is going to be in our workforce. Now here's the hitch. Our working age population is not going to grow. You wouldn't know it to look at this graph from 1960 through 2020 because we've seen growth in our working age population throughout all of those decades. But when we project forward, just a stagnant line, okay? We're not getting any more workers, or we're not growing our workforce, at least not in the same way that we anticipate and hope to see jobs growing. So let me put this in context. Just flash forward with me 7 years to 2028, when we expect to see about 3.3 million jobs in Minnesota. There are 33 briefcases here, each representing about 100,000 jobs. And we expect there to be 3.4 million working age adults. So we've got this perfect match, right, between 3.3 million jobs, 3.4 million workers. We've got the jobs covered by the workers in theory, with actually one little person out there, or 100,000 people, who can kind of take it easy. Except when I started this presentation, I said about 80% of Minnesota's working age adults are actually working, and that's really high. We're first in the nation, tied with North Dakota, and that's about the highest we ever see. So if we apply 80% to that number, so even holding steady our levels of employment for the next 7 years at a really high level, we end up with 6 briefcases unattended by people, or 600,000 jobs that we don't have people to fill. So that's a problem. Now, here's another problem, or an opportunity, if you think of it that way. Minnesota is home to some of the largest gaps in employment by race in the nation. When we rank ourselves with other states looking at the gaps in employment, we rank towards the bottom. So this shows you the gap between the share of white adults who are working and American Indian adults who are working. 26 percentage points separate those shares of adults working, and we rank 49th. On the white Asian gap, we rank 46th. On the white black gap, we rank 45th. And on the white Hispanic gap, we rank 41st. So in all cases, we are in the bottom 10 states for having some of the widest gaps in employment by race and ethnicity. Now, like I said, this is both a really significant problem, but some of us might see it as an opportunity too, to home grow a workforce here that is not currently engaged in employment. So we don't have to be home to these large racial and ethnic gaps in employment. And actually, if we close the gaps, we could see at least 100,000 more people in the workforce. So we start to chip away at that workforce shortage that we anticipate seeing. We're not going to do it just with these gaps. We know there have to be other strategies. But to start, this is a really sort of lucrative way to proceed. I'm going to zip through these. That's quite all right. This was going to talk about education. So I'm going to zip through those. Bottom line here, we're not preparing all adults to succeed. I want to talk about this issue, though, of representation. So on our project at Wilder Research, we've looked at the share of adults in leadership positions by their demographic characteristics. And what we found, unsurprisingly, is that people in leadership positions don't actually look like the people they serve. When we actually map it out with data, you can see about 16% of all adult Minnesotans identify as BIPOC. When we look at leaders in each of these 3 sectors, in general, we see lower percentages of people who are BIPOC among leaders. Government tends to see some similar shares to the overall population, and one of the reasons we found is because of elections. We break down some of the hiring barriers that we've built into other sectors through allowing people to elect people who represent them or look like them. So give some sort of hints at what we could be doing in hiring to break down some of those barriers. We also surveyed Minnesota leaders, and what we learned is that some white government and business leaders push back against the idea that DEI is even an issue, saying, we don't have a problem with it, we're already doing too much in this area, and or the responsibility is really on people who are BIPOC themselves for working to get into these positions. And so these perceptions, these ideas exist, and if we see this as problematic, we've got work to do. Okay, so what do? Well, in this project, we went through piles and piles and piles of research literature to see what best practices look like in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we distilled it into this 3-pager. It's a PDF on our website on mncompass.org with 23 best practices in diversity, equity, and inclusion, with some surprising findings. Things like trainings on DEI don't work. And so dig into these findings, see what you can do in your organizations and positions to potentially put some of these into practice. And with that, how did I do?
Amazing.
All right. So I know we're short on time. If you do have questions, oh, do we have time? Okay. I was going to say, if your question doesn't get answered, feel free to email me, but yeah.
So comment and question, I'm sorry we didn't give you time to go through your,
Quite all right.
your education part. That's important because that was shocked when I came to Minnesota and found out we had the worst achievement gap in the United States. I expected that to be like southern states, like Alabama or something like that. And it's not that we're full of racists. It's historically, our state did stuff to lift up white families and didn't do the same for the rest. So just be aware of that historical thing. The question I had as far as that 90% growth in Minnesota, do you know how much of that is from immigrants? Because is there a difference between just starting a black person that is from the United States versus an immigrant who has those other jobs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we look at population growth, about a third of our population growth is from immigration. So net gains from people coming to Minnesota from other countries versus those leaving Minnesota for other countries. So about a third. Then of the remaining 2/3, about half of that population change. When we look at birth records right now, about half of births are to mothers from other countries. So it's technically babies being born who are American citizens, but from parents who are foreign-born. So a lot of our growth right now is coming from foreign-born populations. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Great presentation. Hey, one thing on that census. If 70 more people in the state of New York would have filled out a census, we would have lost a congressional seat. Wow. Which meant we would have got 1/8 less money of appropriations from the federal government across the board. It was a huge thing. 70 census forms. So next time the census comes up, that's how important it is. Question, I'm actually assigned workforce development, and the county plays a big role in it. We work as much with the schools. Melissa does a great job. Many more of our employees, talented employees, leave our county, and we want to keep them here, and we want to help develop the workforce for the companies to grow. Got any tips on how to keep employees here?
Keep them here.
You know, we got to grow business, and it's just any.
Yeah, keeping them here is a big question. When I've looked at migration flows, people leaving not just the county but the state, we see a lot of people leave to Texas, Florida, and Arizona. And why are they leaving? No, not the income tax. They might leave because of that. It's retirement. It's sort of weather, but it's retirement. But when we look at the next largest flow, it's to North Dakota, or has been to North Dakota because of job opportunities. So economic opportunity is really key. And it's economic opportunity in terms of, I mean, you talked about it, salary and all the benefits that come with that. But what we've found in surveys of people who leave for other places, especially younger people who are going to trendy places like Austin and Charlotte, North Carolina, it's a lot of BIPOC folks who do not feel welcome in Minnesota. And so Minnesota nice is not so nice. In fact, it's pretty threatening for the people who are trying to stay here, but ultimately leave because they want to find community. And so I feel like Greater MSP has done some really good work in terms of efforts to help BIPOC communities in particular find community, find mentors. And that's, like I said, given the way our populations are changing, that's really critical to keeping people here and making sure we have a vibrant workforce. Yeah. Great. All right.
Thank you
Thanks,
very much,
everyone.
Allison.